Hi, in this video we will learn port mapping in Docker. By default, when we create a container in Docker, the application running inside the container will be accessible only in our Docker host. Okay, so the users can't access the application from the outside of our Docker host. So for example, here when we run a container using the Nginx image, so here we will use the Nginx Alpine image. Here, when we create a container, we can access the application running inside this container, okay? And we can do that using the port of the container and the IP of the container. So with Docker, when a container is created, an IP will be assigned to this container. So here, if we run docker ps, here we find our container created using the Nginx image, and here is the port that we will use to access the application inside this container. And to get the IP address here, we can use the docker inspect command. So this command will display many information about this container. Okay, so we run docker inspect and we give it either the name or the ID of the container. So here we get those data about this container created here using this command. And if we go here, so here we find the IP assigned to this port. Okay, so with this IP and the port that we have here, the port 80, we can access our application either, for example, using curl or from the browser. So for example, here we can access the application using the IP 172.17.0.2, and then we use the port 80. So here we get this HTML code from the container. Okay, the same we can access this application from the browser. So let's open Google Chrome and let's type here this IP address, so 172.17.0.2, and here we will use the port 80. So here is the default view from our Nginx container. Okay, so the application running inside the container is accessible inside our Docker host. Okay, but users outside of our Docker host cannot access the application. To make our application accessible from external users from the outside of our Docker host, here we have to map a port from the Docker host to the port 80 of the container. Okay, so let's stop here this Nginx container and let's create another container and map a port from our Docker host to the port 80 of this container. So here we will use docker run Nginx Alpine, which is the name of the Docker image, and here to map a port we use the -p option, and then we map a port from our Docker host to the port of the container. Okay, so for example, here the container will be listening on the port 80, so this is the port of the container, and here, for example, we can map the port 8000 from our Docker host. So here 8000 is the port of our Docker host. We want to map this port to the port 80 of the Nginx container. Okay, so now by creating this container, I'm mapping the port 8000 to the port 80 of the container. The application running inside the container will be accessible from external users using the IP of the Docker host combined with this port, which is 8000. Okay. So here we have created a container using the Nginx Alpine image, and we have mapped the port 8000 of our Docker host to the port 80 of the Nginx container. So here, if we run docker ps, we find here that we have mapped the port 8000 of the Docker host to the port 80 of the Nginx container. Okay, so now external users can access the application running inside the Docker, inside this container, using the IP of our Docker host combined with this port. Okay, the same here, we can create another container. So docker run, we can use the same image or we can use another image. So here, let's create another Nginx container using the Nginx Alpine image. And the same here, we can map the port 80 of the container to a port of our Docker host. So for example, we can map the port 8001 of our Docker host to the port 80 of the Nginx container. So now the traffic coming to the port 8001 to our Docker host will be routed to the port 80 of this Nginx container. Okay, so here if we run docker ps, so here we have the container created using this command, and here we see that we have mapped the port 8001 of our host to the port 80 of this Nginx container. Okay, a very important thing that we have to know here is that we can't map more than one container to the same port of the Docker host. Okay, so for example, here we can't create another container and map the port 80 to the port 8000 of our Docker host. Okay, and that's because this port of our Docker host is already used by another container. Okay, so here if we try to create this container, here we get an error, and here Docker says that the port 8000 is already allocated. Okay, the same for the port 8001. So here we have to use another port that is not allocated. For example, we can use the port 8080. Okay, so we can't map more than one container to the same port of the Docker host. So in Docker, when we create a container, the application running inside the container will be accessible inside the Docker host, and we can access it using the IP of the Docker container and the port of the container. Okay, if you want to make the application accessible from external users, here you have to map a port from the Docker host to the port of the container where the container is listening. So that's it for now. I hope that everything is clear, and thank you very much.